Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take your source material, the articles, the research, your own notes, and really figure out what's important, what truly stands out, giving you that shortcut to being well-informed without drowning in the details.
Exactly. We aim to cut through the noise, pinpoint the crucial insights, and hopefully uncover a few surprising facts that make the material stick.
And today, we are diving deep into the life and presidency of George H.W. Bush. This is a figure who was undeniably at the helm during a period of absolutely massive global upheaval and transformation.
A genuinely pivotal figure. Yeah, he wasn't just, watching history unfold. He was actively guiding the United States through the dramatic end of one whole geopolitical era and into the really uncertain, complex start of a new one.
We've got a fascinating stack of sources guiding us through this deep dive. We have official historical accounts, detailed biographies covering his extensive career, and also, what makes this dive particularly intriguing, a source that introduces a unique kind of thought-provoking perspective. It raises questions about some of the unseen forces and, well, strategies that might have been at play during his time in power.
Yeah, that one source offers a more speculative, maybe even a hypothesis-driven lens. It suggests that perhaps not everything about these monumental events was exactly as it appeared on the surface. It really challenges us, to look beyond the obvious headlines and consider deeper currents.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to synthesize these different viewpoints. We want to understand the factual milestones of his truly remarkable life and career because there were many.
There really were.
We want to explore the major challenges he faced while in the White House, both domestically and internationally. And crucially, we're going to unpack some of the more intriguing, perhaps less discussed interpretations presented in the material you've shared.
Especially from that particular source, the one that sparks some fascinating questions.
Exactly.
We'll trace his journey right from being a daring young pilot in wartime, through a long and varied path in public service, all the way to the very top job in the country.
We'll examine how he navigated the incredibly complex end of the Cold War, major conflicts like the Persian Gulf War, and we'll consider what that one source compellingly refers to as the subtle alchemy of global power. Intriguing phrase?
Really is.
Get ready to get well-informed on the key moments and the lingering questions surrounding the man sometimes referred to simply as Bush 41, or, in that intriguing and perhaps fitting phrase from one of our sources, the quiet alchemist.
Let's unpack this rich material.
Okay, let's start by laying the essential foundation, looking at his early life, his service, and the path that eventually led him all the way to the presidency. Our sources tell us George Herbert Walker Bush was born on June 12, 1924, in Milton, Massachusetts.
Right, and right from the start, you see a connection to a family with a really strong tradition of public service. His father, Prescott Bush, he served as a senator from Connecticut.
So he's born into a lineage already kind of steeped in American political life. It's clear from our sources that this wasn't just a single generation's involvement. One source points out he was part of a political dynasty, a dynasty that would ultimately span 3 generations, culminating not just in his own presidency, but, that of his eldest son later on.
Yeah, that kind of background likely shaped his understanding of governance and public duty from a very early age, you'd have to think.
Definitely.
Growing up in that environment, witnessing his father's work, it certainly provides a unique lens on the world of politics and service. And that sense of duty manifested very early, spurred by global events.
Right. On his 18th birthday, this is amazing, in the midst of World War II, he enlisted in the armed forces, specifically the Navy.
Yeah, think about that decision, turning 18 and immediately choosing to put himself right in harm's way rather than pursuing maybe more traditional paths like college first.
And he became the youngest pilot in the Navy when he received his wings. 18 years old, flying combat missions. That's just remarkable.
It really highlights a certain courage and commitment. Our sources highlight his wartime heroism. He flew 58 combat missions in the Pacific Theater during World War II. That was incredibly dangerous work back then.
58 missions. And the danger became starkly real on one of those missions. While flying a torpedo bomber, his plane was hit by Japanese anti-aircraft fire over the Pacific. It's a harrowing story.
It truly is. He was forced to bail out, but tragically the other 2 crew members on his plane didn't survive.
Oh, wow.
He was the only one rescued from the water, picked up by a U.S. submarine, the USS Finback. For his bravery during this ordeal and his service overall, he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross.
That survival story is intense. Just imagine. And that experience, facing mortal danger firsthand in combat, it's absolutely crucial to understanding him, isn't it?
Absolutely.
One source specifically highlights that as a decorated WWII pilot, he understood conflict intimately. He knew the stakes, the costs, the realities of war in a way that only direct experience can provide.
Yeah, that kind of trauma and, well, courage, it shapes a person profoundly, particularly someone who becomes a future commander-in-chief. You can imagine how that informed his later decisions regarding military action.
Definitely gives you a different perspective. Now, moving to his personal life alongside his service, our sources tell us he married Barbara Pierce in January 1945. That was while he was still serving, right?
Yes, exactly. The beginning of a famously long and devoted partnership. They went on to have 6 children: George W., Robin, Jeb, Neil, Marvin, and Dorothy.
A big family. And there is a profound tragedy in their family story, which our sources mention. Their daughter Robin died at the age of 3 from leukemia.
An unimaginable loss for any family, really. One that clearly left a deep and lasting mark on both George and Barbara Bush, despite their very public lives. It reminds you of the personal struggles behind the public figures.
So true. After the war, he took a different path initially than purely pursuing politics right away. He went to Yale, graduated in 1948. He even captained the baseball team there, showing some early leadership qualities, maybe.
Right, captained the Yale baseball team. And instead of heading straight back to the Northeast political scene immediately, he embarked on a career in the burgeoning Texas oil industry.
Ah, Texas.
Yeah, this move was significant. It established his independence, built his own fortune outside of the family's traditional base in the Northeast.
And it's from this Texas space that he re-entered the world of politics, following in his father's footsteps, but on his own terms, sort of.
Exactly. He served 2 terms as a representative to Congress from Texas, starting in the mid-1960s.
Okay.
He also made 2 attempts to win a Senate seat from Texas in 64 and 70, but was unsuccessful both times.
Interesting. So those losses, however, they didn't derail his political ambition or his path to high office. Instead, he moved into a series of really important appointed positions under Presidents Nixon and Ford.
Right. And these roles were absolutely key to building that extensive resume and deep expertise, particularly in foreign affairs and intelligence, that would define his later career.
This is where his path takes some really interesting turns, providing unique preparation, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. He served as ambassador to the United Nations in the early 1970s, gaining that multilateral diplomatic experience at a crucial time on the global stage.
Then he became chairman of the Republican National Committee during the difficult Watergate scandal era. That must have been a tough job.
Oh, yeah. Requiring a lot of political navigation during a period of intense crisis for his party.
Definitely.
Following that, he was appointed chief of the U.S. Liaison Office in the People's Republic of China. That was from 1974 to 1975.
Okay, China. That sounds incredibly significant. This was before the U.S. and China had full diplomatic relations, right?
Exactly. So he was essentially the top U.S. representative in Beijing during a very scented period of normalization.
Yeah.
This gave him unparalleled insight into the workings of the Chinese government and culture. First-hand experience.
Wow. And then perhaps most significantly for our discussion today, especially considering that quiet alchemist angle,
Right.
he served as director of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, from 1976 to 1977 under President Ford.
That CIA role is incredibly noteworthy, especially when we look at this material through the lens of that one particular source we mentioned.
Right.
That source heavily emphasizes that as CIA director, Bush gained unparalleled insight into the world's hidden mechanisms. Think about what that means. Access to top-secret intelligence, understanding covert operations, learning the secrets governments don't want known.
This is really where the distinctive perspective, the whole quiet alchemist idea starts to take shape, isn't it?
It seems so.
That same source doesn't just state he had this insight. It poses a direct question. It asks, was his entire career building this incredibly diverse set of experiences from wartime pilot with intimate knowledge of conflict to diplomat in the UN and China to political leader and finally to the head of the nation's intelligence apparatus? Was all of this a meticulous preparation for the global shifts he would oversee just a decade or so later?
And it pushes even further, asking if his deep involvement in espionage while at the CIA gave him access to secrets that would profoundly influence his presidency.
Right.
It's suggesting that his intelligence background wasn't just part of his resume, but perhaps a fundamental source of knowledge and maybe even leverage that shaped his approach to the presidency.
This really does raise an important question for you, the listener. to consider as you think about his time in office. How might a background like leading the Central Intelligence Agency, with its focus on intelligence gathering, analysis, covert action, how does that shape a leader's view of the world?
Yeah, their trust in information, their approach to international relations, it's got to be a very different kind of lens than someone coming purely from, say, legislative politics or a business background.
It suggests a comfort level and familiarity with, I don't know, information streams and strategic considerations that most public figures simply don't have access to.
Right. It implies a potential for decision-making based on a much deeper, perhaps even hidden understanding of global dynamics. A fascinating thought.
Okay, so moving on to his path to the presidency itself. He ran for president himself in 1980, but lost the Republican nomination to Ronald Reagan.
Correct. But Reagan recognized his experience and his appeal perhaps to different wings of the party and chose Bush as his running mate.
So they served 2 terms together in the White House, Reagan as president, Bush as vice president.
To providing him with 8 years of experience right there at the highest level of the executive branch. He was observing Reagan's leadership, involved in handling both domestic and foreign policy. Invaluable experience, really.
That experience positioned him well for his own run. In 1988, Bush secured the Republican nomination and went on to defeat the Democratic candidate Michael Dukakis in the general election.
He officially took office on January 20th, 1989, becoming the 41st president of the United States. Our sources note that he brought a specific sentiment to the White House at the outset of his term.
Yeah.
A stated wish to make the United States a kinder and gentler nation.
That phrase is often remembered, isn't it? And it conveyed a desire for a certain tone in domestic life, maybe a contrast to the more confrontational politics of the Reagan years or the turbulent global scene he was about to face.
Could be, because his presidency, from 1989 to 1993, it coincided with a truly fundamentally changing world. The ground was shifting under everyone's feet.
Absolutely. If the 1980s were about the height of Cold War tension, the early 1990s under Bush were about its dramatic conclusion. It happened so fast.
Incredibly fast. Our sources repeatedly highlight that during his term, the entire communist empire in Eastern Europe began to break apart, famously symbolized, of course, by the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989.
Right near the start of his term. And within just 2 years of him taking office, the Soviet Union itself, the primary adversary of the United States for over 4 decades, it ceased to exist entirely in December 1991.
Gone. Just like that. These were events that historians had speculated about, but very few expected them to happen so quickly or, crucially, so relatively peacefully.
That's the key point, isn't it? Managing this monumental transformation was perhaps the defining challenge and achievement of his presidency.
It really seems so. According to our sources, he handled this period with remarkable restraint and diplomatic skill. He was careful, very careful, to avoid triumphalism, declaring victory in a way that could have alienated the dissolving Soviet Union or provoked instability.
That restraint was crucial. He consciously avoided, spiking the football, so to speak. He leveraged his considerable foreign policy experience, think back to the UN, China, and his natural gift for personal diplomacy.
Right, building relationships.
To develop a working relationship with Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev.
And this personal relationship was vital. It enabled continued collaboration, even as the Soviet state was literally crumbling. It facilitated things like arms control agreements, like the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty Start 1, signed in 91.
Which significantly reduced the nuclear arsenals of both nations.
Exactly. And it helped manage the incredibly complex security implications of all these new nations emerging from the former Soviet bloc. It was a delicate, high-stakes time.
But here is where that quiet alchemist source interjects again, with a really fascinating layer of inquiry. It challenges the straightforward historical narrative.
How so?
It asks, was this solely masterful diplomacy and statesmanship, expertly executed in the moment as these events unfolded? Or, given Bush's unique background, were there long-term, perhaps covert strategies put in motion decades earlier, maybe during his time in the intelligence community, that were finally coming to fruition during his presidency?
Wow. So suggesting a much longer game was at play.
Potentially. Specifically, with his extensive intelligence background, the source directly asks, Did Bush possess unseen leverage or knowledge that quietly guided this seismic geopolitical shift?
So it's suggesting the peaceful end of the Cold War might not have been purely the result of public negotiations and political pressure,
Right.
but potentially influenced by insights or means only accessible to someone with his particular history, maybe leveraging information gathered covertly over years.
It's a powerful idea, central to that quiet alchemist concept, that behind the visible facade of diplomacy, there might have been a hidden layer of strategy or intelligence influencing these truly global, history-altering events.
Fascinating. He himself spoke about the significance of this era, though. One source quotes him from a commencement address stating the magnitude. "We are approaching the conclusion of an historic post-war struggle between two visions, one of tyranny and conflict and one of democracy and freedom." He clearly understood the weight of the moment.
No doubt. His public statements reflected that understanding of the historical context. But that quiet alchemist source wants us to consider if his actions were perhaps guided by more than just that publicly shared understanding.
By information or leverage only he, with his background, possessed.
Exactly. Now, beyond navigating the end of the Cold War, Bush's presidency also involved decisive military interventions. One notable example occurred relatively early in his term, the intervention in Panama. Operation Just Cause, December 1989.
Right. He sent American troops into Panama with the stated goal of overthrowing the corrupt regime of General Manuel Noriega. Noriega was facing drug trafficking charges in the U.S. at the time.
Now, here's where that one source adds another layer of complexity that ties back to Bush's past. It notes, rather pointedly, that Noriega was a former CIA asset who had turned into a drug trafficker.
The CIA connection again.
Yeah, that adds a potential personal or historical dimension to the conflict, given Bush's own history leading the CIA just over a decade earlier.
Interesting. The official reasons cited for the intervention were clear and presented publicly. Protect American lives in Panama, combat international drug trafficking. Those were the public justifications, according to our sources.
That same source, the quiet alchemist one, it highlights whispers. And that word itself suggests secrecy or unconfirmed information, right? Whispers suggesting deeper motives. These speculated motives included the possibility of a personal vendetta against a former contact who had gone rogue, referring to Noriega's CIA ties and his subsequent activities. Another suggested motive was that it was meant as a decisive message sent to other rogue leaders in the post-Cold War era, basically demonstrating swift U.S. willingness to use force when deemed necessary. A warning shot, maybe?
Right. The source directly asks, what unseen intelligence or perhaps a hidden personal history with Noriega truly lay behind this swift and controversial intervention?
It's not just historical speculation. It explicitly links the intervention to the potential for hidden information or past relationships influencing presidential decisions, again prompting us to consider the implications of Bush's intelligence background.
Was there more to the Noriega situation than met the public eye, perhaps known only to a former CIA director? It certainly makes you wonder.
A far larger and more complex military action under his command was, of course, the Persian Gulf War, Operations Desert Shield, and later Desert Storm.
This conflict began in August 1990, when the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein invaded the neighboring oil-rich nation of Kuwait.
Right, a blatant act of aggression. And Saddam Hussein then threatened to move further into Saudi Arabia, a key U.S. ally and, a major oil producer. The stakes were incredibly high.
Bush's response was swift and incredibly strong. He vowed to free Kuwait and confront Iraq, famously declaring, "This will not stand." That quote really highlights his resolve, doesn't it? It's included in one of our sources.
It does. And importantly, he didn't act unilaterally at first. He successfully rallied the United Nations and assembled what our sources describe as an unprecedented international coalition.
Yeah, that coalition was key. It involved numerous countries contributing troops, resources, political support. It gave the intervention broad international legitimacy, which was very important diplomatically.
It was a massive undertaking. He sent 425,000 American troops to the region as part of this huge coalition force. I think the total was over 700,000 troops from something like 35 countries.
It's just enormous. The military campaign, Operation Desert Storm, launched in January 1991. It began with a lengthy and intense air and missile bombardment campaign targeting Iraqi forces and infrastructure, softening them up.
And following weeks of this aerial assault, the ground phase began, and it was remarkably short and decisive.
Astonishingly so. A mere 100-hour land battle completely routed Iraq's million-man army in Kuwait. It was a textbook conventional military victory, achieved quickly, relatively low coalition casualties compared to what many had feared. Kuwait was liberated.
A clear success based on the stated objectives.
Yet even with this clear-cut military success and the stated objectives being achieved liberating Kuwait, the quiet alchemist source poses questions about the deeper strategic drivers.
Always digging deeper. What does it ask this time?
It asks, beyond the clear humanitarian reasons freeing Kuwait and the economic reasons securing oil supplies and regional stability, were there deeper, unspoken geopolitical motivations for this overwhelming show of force?
Like what?
Well, it continues, asking, were there hidden intelligence assessments or future strategic calculations about the region's long-term oil production, political stability, or perhaps containing Iran, that truly drove this surgical strike, potentially leaving the ultimate, more complex goals subtly obscured from the public?
So again, this perspective invites us to look beyond the publicly stated goals and consider if the decision-making was influenced by classified information or long-term strategic thinking not shared widely.
Exactly. It suggests that the visible success in Kuwait might have served a more complex, less articulated geopolitical purpose, maybe informed by intelligence that only a few people, potentially including the president with his background, were privy to.
So while his foreign policy tenure was marked by these massive history-defining events, the end of the Cold War, the Gulf War Bush faced significant domestic challenges that ultimately impacted his political future.
That's right. It's a classic story in some ways. Despite soaring public approval ratings immediately following the decisive victory in Desert Storm, incredibly high ratings.
Highest ever for a president at that point, I think.
Something like that, yeah. But his popularity domestically proved fragile. Our sources point out he was unable to effectively address or surmount uncertainty about the economy at home.
He faced an economic downturn during his presidency, entering a recession in 1990. This economic climate became a major liability for him.
And compounding this economic challenge was his famous campaign promise from 1988, the one everyone remembers.
Oh, yeah. Read my lips. No new taxes. Iconic. Problematic, but iconic. It's quoted specifically in one of our sources.
That promise really painted him into a corner. Facing a growing federal budget deficit, he ultimately agreed to a compromise with Congress in 1990 that included, well, raising taxes, breaking that very famous promise.
Ouch. Politically damaging.
Hugely. According to our sources, this broken promise, seen as a betrayal of trust by many voters, contributed significantly to his re-election defeat. It handed his opponents a powerful and easy-to-understand line of attack.
But the quiet alchemist source, true to its theme, adds another layer of inquiry here too, right? Pushing us to consider the why behind that politically damaging decision.
Yes, it probes this moment, asking, was this merely a straightforward political misstep? A poor calculation of public opinion versus fiscal necessity? Or was he privy to dire, unseen economic forecasts, perhaps a hidden truth about the true state of the national debt, or overwhelming global financial pressures that forced his hand, knowing full well the political cost he would pay?
So, suggesting it wasn't just a political blunder, but maybe a necessary evil driven by information he couldn't publicly share.
Potentially. This perspective suggests that perhaps the decision to raise taxes wasn't simply a political capitulation or a fiscal preference, but maybe a necessary, painful choice driven by critical, non-public economic intelligence. Information that convinced him inaction would be catastrophic, even if it meant sacrificing his presidency.
It certainly makes you think about the immense pressures leaders face and the possibility that some difficult decisions are made based on information that just can't be fully shared or explained to the public without causing panic or revealing sensitive details. There might be a hidden calculus involved.
Absolutely. Ultimately, grappling with the economy and that broken tax promise, he lost his bid for re-election in 1992 to the Democratic challenger, Bill Clinton.
Right. And our sources state this loss was partly due to the economic uncertainty, but also a more general urge for change after 12 Republican years in the White House, referring to Bush's term following Reagan's 2 terms.
Voters often desire fresh leadership after a decade or more under one party, don't they? And the economic climate certainly amplified that sentiment, regardless of the underlying reasons for his economic policies.
Seems fair. Now let's revisit that idea of the unseen hand of diplomacy and look at his overall legacy through the various lenses our sources provide.
Okay. One source particularly spends time highlighting his extraordinary mastery of diplomacy. This source emphasizes that his diplomatic success was often conducted through quiet back channels and personal relationships built over decades of service. Remember that extensive list of appointed roles, UN, China, CIA. They all provided opportunities to build a global network.
Right. It wasn't just collecting titles on a resume. It was building connections, understanding people and systems.
Exactly. That diverse career path wasn't just about holding titles. It was about building connections and gaining a nuanced understanding of international players and power structures. The source states he understood the nuances of global power dynamics better than most, suggesting his effectiveness wasn't just formal negotiation, but subtle influence, personal touch.
And his source goes even further into the speculative realm, asking some very pointed questions about these hidden diplomatic efforts.
What?
Like,
What were the true, untold stories of these unseen negotiations? What delicate compromises, what bold promises, or what silent threats were exchanged in confidence, potentially forging the path for a new era of international relations beyond the public's gaze?
wow. Those are potent questions. They challenge the standard historical accounts, which often focus just on the formal summits and public statements, right?
Exactly. They suggest that major diplomatic shifts, like the peaceful reunification of Germany or managing the transition of post-Soviet states, might have been shaped as much by confidential exchanges and strategic maneuvers behind the scenes as by overt actions.
This is really the core element of the quiet alchemist concept, isn't it? The idea of a leader subtly influencing global outcomes through means the public doesn't fully perceive.
Seems to be, yeah.
Nevertheless, looking at his more conventional legacy and influence, his family's political traditions certainly continued and flourished after his presidency.
No doubt about that. Our sources note that his sons, George W. Bush and Jeb Bush, both went on to become governors of major states, George W. in Texas and Jeb in Florida.
A direct continuation of that political dynasty, extending it right into the next generation.
And when his eldest son, George W., ran for president in 2000, George H.W. Bush was a visible and vocal supporter, famously telling voters, "This boy, this son of ours, is not going to let you down."
A proud father campaigning for his son's political ascent. And George W. Bush's election victory in 2000 was historic for the family, wasn't it?
It was. It made George H.W. Bush the second president in U.S. history after John Adams to live to see a son elected president. Quite remarkable.
One source includes a kind of poignant anecdote about his later years.
Yeah.
Noting that family members observed that the proud patriarch took criticism directed at his son George W.'s presidency even more emotionally and personally than criticism directed at himself.
That really speaks volumes, doesn't it?
Mm.
About his paternal pride and the depth of his bond with his children, especially when their own political careers were under scrutiny.
George H.W. Bush passed away on November 30th, 2018 at the age of 94. He lived a long life, spanning significant portions of the 20th and 21st centuries and witnessing truly seismic global changes.
His life story, as laid out in the sources, is one of really exceptional service and navigating truly historic periods. Just an incredible arc.
And bringing it back to that distinctive perspective from one of our sources, it summarizes him in a unique way, not just as a former president, but as a quiet leader, a shrewd strategist, the alchemist of a transforming world.
That phrase again. And it leaves us, and you, the listener, with a final thought-provoking question that encapsulates this alternative framing.
What's the final question?
Were his triumphs achieved through unseen leverage? And did his hidden knowledge, perhaps gained during those years in intelligence and high-level diplomacy, guide his decisions in ways we are only now beginning to comprehend?
This perspective doesn't necessarily contradict the established historical facts, right? It's more like an overlay.
Exactly. It invites you to consider the possibility of layers beneath the surface, the idea that the visible narrative of leadership, especially in foreign policy and intelligence matters, might only be part of the story.
It's a lens that suggests his unique path might have equipped him with tools and insights that influenced his presidency in ways not always apparent to the public or even traditional historians. Adds a whole other dimension.
It really does.
So we've taken a deep dive into the sources you provided about George H.W. Bush. We've traced his remarkable journey from a daring young pilot during wartime through a multifaceted career that built significant, perhaps unparalleled experience in diplomacy and intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And finally into the presidency, where he navigated the dramatic conclusion of the Cold War and major global conflicts like the Persian Gulf War.
We've covered the factual milestones of his life and tenure, from his family roots in public service, his heroic military service, his key appointed roles like UN ambassador and CIA director, through the pivotal events of his presidency like the fall of the Berlin Wall, the swift intervention in Panama, the successful international coalition and campaign in the Persian Gulf War.
And, of course, the significant domestic challenge of the economy that ultimately impacted his bid for re-election.
Right. And crucially, we've explored that fascinating and challenging perspective offered by one source, framing him as a quiet alchemist.
Yeah, that angle raises intriguing questions about unseen leverage, potential hidden motivations behind key decisions like Panama or the Gulf War strategy, and the potential untold stories of his quiet diplomacy, especially given his background in intelligence.
These questions invite you, the listener, to think critically about how leadership truly operates, particularly in times of significant global change and when dealing with sensitive foreign policy and intelligence matters that often occur outside the public eye.
So whether you see him primarily as the steady, experienced hand guiding the nation through turbulent waters with traditional statesmanship,
Which is a valid view.
absolutely, or as an intriguing strategist, potentially operating with unseen knowledge and employing hidden tactics rooted in his unique background.
The sources reveal a figure whose life and presidency were undeniably shaped by unique experiences and who presided over an era that fundamentally altered the global landscape. No question about that.
So here's something for you to consider as you reflect on this deep dive. How much of presidential decision-making, especially in the crucial areas of foreign policy, national security, and intelligence matters, necessarily happens outside the public eye?
That's a great question.
And how does that inherent secrecy and the potential for unseen leverage or information asymmetry suggested by perspectives like the quiet alchemist, how does that shape our understanding of their actions and ultimately their historical legacy?
It adds a complex layer to the historical record, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It prompts us to ask, what don't we know? And how does that missing information potentially change the picture? A lot.